So just as a reminder, there's some safety information here, and you'll see that Nourianz is indicated to treat off episodes of people who have Parkinson's disease. It is adjunctive to levodopa, so people are already taking some formulation of levodopa, and this would be added to that. Additionally, if you have a history of any of these issues that are listed here, so dyskinesia, a history of psychosis, so that can be having delusions or hallucinations, and then people who have problems with their liver, smoke, and then if people who are pregnant or planning to become pregnant. Fortunately, that's not an issue. That's all that happens with Parkinson's disease, although I have had interesting experience of managing someone who had Parkinson's during pregnancy. So it does happen, certainly in young population. So if you're planning on becoming pregnant, and that's something you want to discuss. What we're going to do today is we're going to spend some time talking about Parkinson's disease. And although I think everyone is pretty familiar with it, hopefully I'll be able to provide some insight and some nuance and help just broaden your understanding a little bit. We'll talk about how movement is controlled. We'll talk about how we treat Parkinson's disease. And then we'll talk a little bit about Nourianz and what role it has in terms of treating Parkinson's. So Parkinson's disease is really the second most common movement disorder in the United States. It's also the second most common neurodegenerative disorder in the United States. It's characterized by neurons in certain areas of the brain that start to die off. And those neurons, in principle, and this is really making it fairly basic, are responsible for producing dopamine, and it helps to control movement. And so when we start to lose these dopamine-producing neurons, we start to lose motor control. And that's where we start to see the typical features that we would expect. People who have tremor, slowness of movement, muscular rigidity, changes in walking in the early phases, but certainly as the disease progresses, you see other things. You can see, statistically, there's about 1 billion people in the U.S. with Parkinson's disease. That number is actually expected to grow substantially, and there's been publications that look at the idea that there's a coming global pandemic in Parkinson's, and that by the year 2040, we're going to see a doubling of the number of people with Parkinson's disease. So there's a lot of factors that contribute, but one of them really is that people are living longer, and this is something that becomes more common with age. About 1 to 2% of people over the age of 65 in the U.S. actually have Parkinson's. So how does this affect people who actually live with this? Well, as I mentioned, the most important symptom is actually slowness of movement, because without slowness of movement, someone doesn't have Parkinsonism, which is just symptoms of Parkinson's. They can have tremor, rest, which we mentioned also as well. You have muscular rigidity as well. But the way that this can actually manifest, as you can see here, you can see loss of facial expression, where people may blink more slowly. In more severe cases, you may actually see people stand or sit with their mouth held open part of the time, or you may even see it a little more often and have drooling. You can see posture. When people walk, you may see a loss of arm swing. Sometimes people will actually hold their arm in a flexed position when they're walking, and then we see the changes in the gait itself, where people start to have shuffling gait. You can have trouble initiating gait. You can have trouble with turning, and so on. The key is that when someone has Parkinson's, it doesn't mean they're going to experience all of these things. So if we have 1 billion people in the U.S. with Parkinson's, we have 1 billion variations on that gene. So what causes Parkinson's? So I mentioned already the idea that Parkinson's is caused by this loss of dopamine-produced neurons, and that those neurons help regulate movement. We don't understand what actually provokes those neurons to start dying off. As best we understand it today, it's probably a combination of, number one, people who have genetic susceptibility. So today, in today's world, we're able to actually identify some gene that predisposes people to having Parkinson's in about 10 to 15% of cases. The most common ones that we see are LRRK2 and GBA, if you've ever heard of those. The reason that that's actually important is because we're starting to see drugs being developed specifically to treat those genetic disorders. And so the gene products of those disorders and so on. So I think that this is a time where genetic testing is going to be common because there's going to be more individualized therapy based on what we call pharmacogenomics. So a person's individual genome may help to dictate treatment a little bit. That's what's probably coming down the pipe a little bit. Today, we don't have those treatments necessarily available. And the environmental part of it is also a key factor. And we know that there's the potential for exposure to herbicides, pesticides, and other chemicals. One example, there's very nice work done in the state of Wisconsin. They happen to have a lot of paper mills in Wisconsin, and they found clusters of people with Parkinson's disease around those paper mills. We know people who have professions where they're exposed to a lot of people, teachers, people in healthcare, are also at an elevated risk of developing Parkinson's. We don't understand why that is. So it's not a cause and effect, it's just an association. So there's still a lot for us to learn, but nonetheless, we're learning more each day. And as we start to piece these things together, it's going to help inform better treatment and potentially newer treatments down the road. So how is movement controlled? I think when I'm talking to residents or fellows, we can really dig down into the weeds about this. And it's very complicated when you start to get into the nuances of this. But the simplest way to think about it is we have two systems that are in balance with each other. We have a system that is called the direct pathway, which is responsible for the go part of things. So it's like stepping on the gas pedal. And to balance that, we have the indirect pathway, which is like a brake. And dopamine actually helps to really modulate that direct pathway. So it's a go sort of neurotransmitter, which means that it's like pressing on the gas. So that's why when people start to lose these dopamine cells, the cells that are producing dopamine, we give medications that replace or mimic the effects of dopamine. So how do we do that? Well, we talk about levodopa, which gets converted into dopamine in the brain. There are drugs called dopamine agonists, which mimic dopamine and bind to dopamine receptors. We have drugs like monoamine oxidase B inhibitors, which are utilizing a way of blocking enzymes that break down dopamine, allowing more dopamine to be present. So in the end, what we're doing on that side of things is actually trying to step on the gas. The braking system is modulated by these adenosine receptors. So that if we have, and there's a sort of strange thing that happens in Parkinson's disease. Not only are we starting to lose the dopamine side of things, where we start to have this being downregulated, but for some reason, we have this counterbalance as well, where we are actually seeing an increase in the A2A receptor activity. So we actually, at the same time, are taking our foot off the gas pedal and stepping on the brake in Parkinson's disease. And so that's where systems really get out of balance. And that's where you start to see those symptoms of slowness of movement and so on start to emerge. So I've already talked about this, I think you see this, but the thing is that the disease is really this imbalance that occurs as a result of this disruption of dopamine producing neurons, and there are lots of downstream effects that occur as a result of this. And so we have this situation again where we're taking our foot off the gas and stepping on the brake pedal at the same time. So I mentioned some of the treatments already in Parkinson's disease, and this is one of these things that, this is where it's the art of treating patients or people who have a disease. And this is where everyone has individualized therapy, and picking among the right medications is really a discussion that people have with their healthcare team. And so there is a right combination of things for everyone. The interesting thing is that combination changes over time. One of the sort of general principles that I'd like to share is that there's this idea of rational polypharmacy, meaning that sometimes there's a whole variety of different medications that I mentioned, and there's others that we potentially use, and it's selecting from those right ones for each individual person. However, the problem will be is that what is right today may not be right down the road, because those cells continue to be lost and get depleted And so as time passes, how the disease manifests in each person varies from one person to the next. So again, I mentioned this idea of levodopa getting turned into dopamine. So at its most basic level, this is what's going on. And we're seeing this depletion of dopamine producing neurons, and we're using levodopa to replace dopamine that's lost. It is the most widely prescribed medication in the world, as a matter of fact, whether it's carbidopa, levodopa, or there are other formulations elsewhere that use other medications to block the same enzyme that carbidopa does. But levodopa is really perceived as the gold standard therapy that provides the highest yield in terms of treatment effect, but also with the lowest risk. But again, any medication potentially has risk. So one of the things that happens in early Parkinson's disease, people experience what sometimes is referred to as a honeymoon period. Other times, it'll, in a medical term, it's actually called a long duration response. And what that really means is that when people are started on medication, we look for, do they actually respond to medication? That's an important criteria to help make the diagnosis. However, they don't necessarily notice any difference from one dose to the next. So in the early stages of Parkinson's, people can take a dose, they don't feel any different other than they know that starting on medication has actually helped to alleviate some of their symptoms. As time passes, however, they can start to notice that there is a difference from one dose to the next. And what happens many times is they feel like as they're coming due for their next dose of medication, they start to have return symptoms. And that can be non-motor symptoms, so people will sometimes start to get anxiety, shortness of breath, sweating, cloudy thinking, and many times it's motor symptoms. And quite honestly, it's often a combination of two. And the return of motor symptoms, again, the typical things that each person experiences, whether it's slowness of movement, or tremor, etc., and they start to feel those, they then take another dose of medication, they start to feel those symptoms slowly subside, and go through this cycle up and down of their medication. So again, this idea of the medication wearing off, when the medication isn't working, is what we call block. So, and then when the medication is working, we refer to that as on. So people fluctuate between these off and on periods. And as you can imagine, if you don't experience it, it's something that can be really challenging for an individual because they know that their medication is going to end today, and they have to plan around it sometimes. There's a lot of ways that we can manage this. That can be, again, using combinations of medications, taking medication more frequently, and so on. But at some point, that you are looking for options beyond just taking levodopa. So again, the approach that we have in terms of treating off time is really, number one, it may be just going from 3 times a day with levodopa to going 4 times a day with levodopa. And then once you get to that, do you go to a 5th time or a 6th time? I saw a patient a couple of days ago who actually, he's taking his medication 10 times a day. So if you can imagine. Is there a limit to how high you go? Is there a limit? Well, the actual dose, there's not necessarily, so the question is there a limit to how high I would go with the actual dose? The answer is not necessarily to treat individuals, but when someone's taking their medication 10 times a day, I mean, I've talked to that individual about a variety of different ways of trying to address this. And, with probably deep brain stimulation surgery being the most appropriate thing for him. However, he is very reticent about that. And so but I think we made a step forward because for the first time his daughter came to an appointment. And introducing that idea to her will spur some discussion at home and so on. So I think that's important, is having family be involved and be engaged is a really critical piece of this. The one thing I haven't talked about in terms of early management of Parkinson's, and really something that's important throughout, and I think I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, is the role of exercise. So it's medication and exercise are really the 2 most important things in managing Parkinson's. And so, yeah, a question. I'm sorry? Well, positive attitude, yes. It's also, I think, critically important. And
But you're talking to a group of people that are involved because those
I know.
So we're
I
talking to a bunch of exercise.
I refer people to rock steady boxing all the time because and I refer them for therapy for things like LSD, power, and so on. And we try to utilize things that are evidence-based and encourage them to really exercise. To sort of sidetrack for just a second, one of the reasons why I'm so adamant about recommending exercise for people, there was really a nice Italian study that was done that looked at people who could engage in intensive inpatient physical therapy for a month every year versus people who were left to just exercise on their own and do some outpatient therapy. And they looked at this group after 3 years. So the same people for 3 years, for a month at a time, were going into an inpatient setting, and they were getting physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language pathologists, working with them, recreational therapy, and so on. And when you looked at the two groups at the end of that 3-year cycle, there was a statistically significant difference between the group who got that inpatient aggressive therapy versus those who were not getting it. So, different healthcare system, it was an experiment. However, I think there's an important lesson that we get from that in terms of how important exercise and moving really is for people who have Parkinson's and a positive attitude. So I wanted to introduce this drug Nourianz to you as a novel treatment in Parkinson's disease. It's something that really, all the other medications that I've mentioned so far, the classes of drugs, so levodopa, dopamine agonists, MAOB inhibitors, COMT inhibitors, and so on, all work on that gas pedal side, that direct pathway. So at some point, if you keep pushing the gas, you've got the gas pedal on the floor, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're able to go any further. I'm from the Detroit area, so I like car analogies. And I know Bowling Green, Kentucky is not so far away where the Corvette where the Corvette is made. So, it's great to go fast, but at some point you've got the pedal to the metal. And Nourianz is the first treatment that actually works on trying to release your foot off the brake. So, again, we're taught not to drive with one foot on the brake and one on the gas. And so this is a way of trying to reduce the impact of that indirect pathway and take our foot off the brake a little bit by blocking these adenosine 2A receptors. Make sense so far? So again, this is a prescription medication. It's intended to treat off episodes for people. So those time periods where you feel like your medication isn't working. But it does it in a holistic way because it's a once-a-day treatment. So it's not that you're taking something just when you need it. You take it once a day, and it works in combination with your other medications. So again, one of the things I thought was very interesting, Aaron developed this drug, did studies both in the U.S. and Japan. And I think one of the most interesting things, and they worked, whether it was a Japanese population, U.S. population, obviously, it's FDA approved, or I wouldn't be here talking about it today. But what to me as a movement disorder neurologist, what was really telling in the studies is how differently people are treated in Japan versus the U.S. So the number of medications that were used much more broadly in Japan, whereas we tend to be a little more reliant on levodopa in the U.S. So I think that when you start to sift through the weeds of their studies, it's really interesting. And I think one of the things is that in the U.S., it means that we might want to take a step back and look at how we're treating people. And it might be okay to add some other medications that are used a little bit less frequently. But Nourianz, again, is the only one of these medications that actually works on that indirect pathway and is taking our foot off the brake. So some safety information, because, of course, any medication has potential side effects. One of them is that you have to make sure that you are not experiencing this. And so when I started the medication, any Parkinson's medication, for one of my patients, I am very cautious about instructing them to see how it affects you before you drive or before you have plans to go out and do it. Because it can enhance, these all are Parkinson's medications, and the side effects is that the most common side effect that we see is actually an increase in dyskinesia. So those extra involuntary movements that are usually associated with on periods. And they're often unavoidable for people who are actually experiencing them. So it's not as if you can say, oh, well, we'll just back off on the medication and we'll reduce the dyskinesia. So, but when I see that there's an increase in dyskinesia associated with medication,
I'll ask in a second here, Zane.
usually suggests to me at least it's getting in there and it's doing something. The question is the dyskinesia that we're seeing worth it when you trade it off in terms of the effect of reducing off periods or off time? Other things to think about are hallucinations and psychosis. Again, I mentioned that at the beginning, that if you're experiencing that, regardless of what treatment you're on, that's something that you need to discuss with your healthcare team. And then fusion, disorientation, aggressive behaviors, which can all be part of that. Yes.
And we had a question come in the chat on Zoom, is that can this medication be taken with someone who has had DBS?
Yes, it can be. So if someone has had DBS and they're still experiencing off episodes, we use all the tools that we have.
It's a deep brain stimulation. So.
Surgical and partial management. It's not, when people go through DBS, one of the things that we see is many times they're able to reduce their medication. That's not the goal of DBS, but it's often an outcome that happens because of DBS, in a way, think of it as electronic medication, which is being administered directly to the brain. Through an electrode.
I have to show it to you. It's amazing.
So, as you can see in the studies, there were more than 700 patients who participated in the Nourianz studies, and all of them were, despite best management of their Parkinson's. So they were on, again, anywhere from one medication, because they all had to be on carbidopa, but they could be on a number of other medications to manage their Parkinson's. And despite that, they're still experiencing off periods during the course of the day. And they were randomized to receive either Nourianz or a placebo, so a sugar pill essentially. And it's a blinded fashion, so neither the patient nor their doctor knew what they were getting. And then they measured how well their symptoms were controlled, and in particular measured off time and measured good on time, so on time without those extra movements, dyskinesia that are actually troublesome, so things that interfere with their day-to-day function. And these are looked at 12 weeks. So, one of the things when I tell my patients, if I'm putting them on something like this, is I'll say, we really want to try this for about 3 months because that's how long the study was. And then we'll take a step back and make a decision. Is this the right therapy for you or is it not? And what we ended up seeing is that on average, despite best medical therapy prior to enrolling in the study, the people who got Nourianz saw another hour and a half reduction in off time. So, the people who were on placebo, they didn't see that same sort of response, but we saw that there was improvement by adding Nourianz to the regimen. So again, whether DBS, which I just look at as part of the regimen, or excuse me, or they're on 2, 3, 4 medications to manage their Parkinson's, adding Nourianz still provided a benefit when we look at the study as a whole. You can see the placebo response was anywhere from 0.2 to 0.6 hours roughly. So we saw that we did have an increase in this good on time as well. So that was without troublesome dyskinesia, but we did see an increase in dyskinesia in the studies. It was about 14% of people. And there are 2 doses. So there's a 20 milligram dose, there's a 40 milligram dose. And when we started out, I mentioned the idea that if you're a smoker, you want to let your doctor know, because smoking actually affects how this drug is metabolized. So ordinarily, when I start someone on the medication, I'll start at 20 milligrams. If it's someone who's a smoker, we'll start at 40 milligrams, just because the enzymes that smoking induces means this gets metabolized more quickly. And so people need a higher dose in order to have an adequate blood level of the medication to help try to treat their symptoms. Other side effects of uncontrolled movements, I mentioned dizziness, constipation, hallucinations, and then problems sleeping. If you are aware of person, if you're on the medication or a loved one is, and you're aware of these, then you have a couple of options. You can report it to the FDA, or you can call Keto and Kieran. Certainly talk to your healthcare team. Whether you report it or not, certainly the first call is to your healthcare team to make sure that if you're having a problem, it gets addressed appropriately.
Are those something specific according to most common, least common, or did you break those up? Like
Well,
15% show that this.
we're going to look at
Okay.
so the increase in dyskinesia was 15%. That was the most common one. 15% for 20 milligrams, 17% for 40 milligrams. But again, the majority of these people actually have pre-existing dyskinesia, so it's not something that necessarily brought it out, but tended towards it. We can see that only 1% discontinued because of hallucination. That was a 40 milligram dose. So one of the things, especially when you, and it's not that they were head-to-head studies, so you can't necessarily say, well, drug X causes this percentage of these side effects, and Nourianz in comparison causes a different percentage. But one of the things that we look at is this actually is a very well-tolerated drug. When you look at the side effects, you sort of look at it in the context of the other things that we use to treat Parkinson's, these are pretty low numbers. And so, one of the things for me, when I'm looking at a patient who may be a little bit more fragile in terms of my patient population, I look at drugs like Nourianz a little bit earlier in their regimen because of the fact that at least I'm more confident that it's going to be safe for them and they're more likely to tolerate it better than some other choices that we may utilize. So it's not without its side effects, and of course people have to know what those are. But it's something that people, again, tend to tolerate pretty well, and it really tend to frequently discontinue the medication simply because of side effects. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So this is, as I mentioned before, this is a once-a-day therapy. So it really can be taken, at any time during the day. It can be taken with food, without food. I just encourage my patients, if it's part of your regimen, try to make it part of your regimen at the same time every day. So if it's you take medications at lunchtime, it's your lunchtime regimen. If it's nighttime or in the morning, etc. But it has a long half-life. So in the end, as long as you're consistent about when you're taking it, it shouldn't matter when during the day it is. These are not actual size, in case you're wondering. It says that right there if you want to swallow. Screen back, but it does come in two strengths. And so, again, most people I would start with a 20 milligram dose and then increase it up to 40 milligram dose. The other thing is that there are a number of different ways that one can get Nourianz. So, of course, it's prescription medication. So, one of your healthcare providers has to prescribe it for you if they feel it's appropriate. Again, that's the conversation you have with your healthcare team. But you can get it through a Credo specialty pharmacy, CVS, Walgreens, and then they can also be picked up at the local pharmacy or shipped to you.
Yeah, one thing, you guys have a really good option in Louisville on 4th Street downtown. There's a Walgreens specialty pharmacy, the parking lot right beside it, where they'll ship it directly to your house. Mallory, her entire team at that Walgreens is amazing.
It's great that you have a resource like that.
They're already stocked, ready to go. Both of those drinks.
Then you go to KeelanCareandCares.com and they can actually help connect you to foundations and other potential support.
But Mallory does that at Walgreens as well.
Well, there you go.
I have an 80% fill rate, which means 80% of people that get written Nourianz in my territory, it gets filled. So for especially drug, that's like pretty over the top.
Yeah, I have to tell you, it's pretty rare that I have someone not stay on the medication because they can't afford it. There's enough resources. I have some patients who say that they don't want to pay for it, which is different than not being able to afford it. And I have one gentleman who I treat who's I know he sold this company for $75 million, and whatever the cost was out of pocket, he said he didn't want to pay for it, but he doesn't qualify for that additional support. He could afford it if he wanted
And then what was that Walgreens? I'm going to tell everybody online.
It's the Walgreens Specialty Community Pharmacy.
It's a Walgreens Specialty
4th Street.
Community Pharmacy on 4th Street.
It's like where 4th Street Live starts.
Yes,
Back up a block and it's on the corner.
a block from 4th Street Live. But they can also mail it to your home as well.
Correct. You don't even have to worry about going downtown and parking and walk. They'll ship it directly to you.
Yeah, they'll just ship it directly to you.
But you have to answer the phone when Walgreens calls to confirm your prescription. People, answer your phones.
That's an important point.
She said that you have to answer your phone if Walgreens calls
Well,
to verify your prescription.
it's not just, it's with any of the pharmacies that, you're getting mail order, they will not ship it to you.
Until they physically
Unless
talk to you.
they-
Yes.
Until they talk to
Oh,
you. So that's one of those things. So when a new medication is starting, it's helpful to know where it's coming from, so that you can answer the phone for it.
I have dad with Parkinson's, and so I fussed at my parents for years, answer the phone.
It's hard when it comes up as a spam alert or something
Oh,
like that. So again, for the majority of people, it hasn't been an issue. They've been able to get the support that they need. I can't say that that's everyone, but it sounds like you have a great resource locally that really helps with that process.
And I try to be a resource. You all have my cell phone number now. Tell your doctors to call me. I mean, I'm always available. I'm always gonna be around because I'm involved with Rocksteady now, so yeah, reach out anytime.
So just some other side effects. Compulsive behaviors, again, this is a warning that actually exists for really every drug we use to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. We know that people who have Parkinson's are a little bit increased risk of having these compulsive behaviors, and they can include things like gambling, shopping, sexual urges, and eating, but can manifest in a variety of different ways. I had one patient who would fiddle with tuning and fine tuning his jet ski and would work for hours at a time, which really just was compulsive behavior, stop the medication, and it went away. So this can happen with any medication, frankly, it can happen with Parkinson's. Most common side effects are anesthesia, dizziness, constipation, nausea, hallucinations, and sound. So not all of them, but each person
Eating.
Another thing is that you and Aaron really tries hard to be a partner in the Parkinson's community, as well as your local Rocksteady and so on. But you see a company on a broader scale, involved with these organizations and supportive of them. And so, it's not just about trying to sell a drug for this company. They actually want to be engaged with the Parkinson's community and try to be a good partner and a good citizen.
Then we'll also add National Parkinson's Institute to that list. So.
Yeah, I know.
But also, we have another question from online. Is it covered by most Medicare supplement drug insurances?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
And as another caveat, one more layer past that, is if you are what's considered a dual eligible, meaning if you're Medicare and Medicaid combined, which in West Virginia is a big deal because Medicaid's our biggest payer plan in West Virginia. I don't know about in the local area, but lots of rural areas where people are dual eligible, it's $9.20.
Okay. So if you are dual eligible Medicare and Medicaid, it is only $9.20.
I didn't know the price, but I know
$9.
that may not be applicable. It's $9. So,
If it's Medicare, Medicaid, that's been done at a national level.
okay.
Yeah.
And that's been done at a national level. So that's across the board, no matter what state, if you're a dual eligible.
Yes.
Something national. So good enough. But it is, so when to further answer the question about the availability, there is some insurance that will require, a prior authorization with what medications you tried previously and so. But again, usually, if you're under the care of someone who has a pretty good sense of how to treat people, they're able to get it approved, and you've probably tried those medications that really are required ahead of time. Or there's a reason why you can't try some of them, and that can be documented as well. So that's a lot of times how the process will go. So just to remind you, if you are experiencing off episodes or a loved one is experiencing off episodes, episodes. First of all, it takes recognition. So remembering that those are those times where the medication doesn't seem to be working, where you can tell that it's starting to wane before the next dose is due. You can certainly talk about those experiences, how they're troublesome, and then, of course, talk to your doctor about how they respond. So you take your next dose of medication and they go on to it. And then it may be that using this different approach is the right thing to treat your symptoms. And so, as I mentioned at the outset, we talked about stepping on the gas all the time and adding levodopa and these other medications. But Nourianz allows us this opportunity that is still novel in treating Parkinson's, which is to take your foot off the brake by blocking those adenosine 2A receptors. So it's a different way, and you can understand, I think, why it works adjunctively alongside the other medication rather than necessarily being something that you would start with. And so if you're experiencing these off episodes, then and you're interested in Nourianz, then that's something you obviously want to talk to your healthcare team about. So I'm just going to stop there and let's see if there are any more questions.
It's stops your off time. Does it entirely stop your off time? Just last a little while, or
So the question is if this will stop off time entirely. And the short answer is I don't know of anything that necessarily will stop off time entirely. So the response that was seen again was on average about an hour and a half less per day. So the people that enrolled in the studies actually had to experience at least 2.5 hours a day of off time. So it did not even stop all the off time for the mildest of people in the studies when you look at it as a population as a whole. There were individuals that, when you look at their diaries, that actually did stop all of their off time. However, that's not the expectation. Off time is really a challenging issue. And the reason that it is that there are a number of things that are happening that contribute to off time. One of them is it's a function of just the disease progressing. And in the brain, those neurons that store dopamine and then ultimately release it are being lost. And so you use this buffer capacity to release it in a more natural fashion, which is what's happening that leads to off time in the first place. The other thing.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, if you don't mind being in front of the camera, because I heard somebody unmute, they might be asking you questions in front of the camera too, but you're fine. Just now that we're finished.
Sure. So the other thing that happens in causing off time is just that the disease itself impacts how medications are absorbed, and particularly the dopamine. So levodopa has to be stomach in order to be absorbed, and it's absorbed in the first part of the small intestine. So number one, you can see a delay in medication leaving the stomach, and therefore we have some challenges in terms of getting into random fashion. Number two, there's an interaction with food, and so protein competes with the absorption of levodopa. So we got all of these factors that combine that contribute to off time.
So is that why you always are supposed to not eat an hour before you take your supplement?
So usually I will tell people that stomach is defined as an hour before you eat or 2 hours after.
Okay.
So it can become pretty, it's hard enough if it does 4, 5, 6 times a day, it becomes that much more challenging. So again, so that's why people are told to try to take another stuff. Again, and that honeymoon thing is that early part of Parkinson's, thank you. It really probably matters because your brain has that ability to buffer levodopa, gets converted to dopamine, gets released in a much more natural fashion. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry. So the comment is that it would seem that it would be more appropriate for people that have freezing. So first of all, the freezing is a much harder one to answer because freezing is a very complex issue. And it's not necessarily related. So 80% of the time, freezing is better when you increase medication. So that would be whether you're adding more levodopa, or adding a dopamine agonist, or potentially adding something like that. The bradykinesia is an obligate feature of Parkinson's. So everyone who has Parkinson's should have bradykinesia as part of it. It doesn't necessarily differentially improve one symptom versus another. It helps reverse those off periods in general. So it's not that it would be, someone who has tremor, if they get better, their tremor gets better when they take medication, which isn't the case for everyone. Reducing their off time should reduce the tremor.
I got a question.
This
There's
year,
a question online.
oh, I'm sorry.
Please.
Do you take this drug with carbidopa, levodopa, or separately?
So the question is, do people take this with carbidopa, levodopa, or separately? And the answer is that studies were done in people, everyone was taking carbidopa, levodopa. So this is a drug that's intended for it to be used alongside of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be taken simultaneously with a dose of carbidopa, levodopa. So it's not like a COMT inhibitor, well, some of the older ones, that you have to take it at the same time you're taking carbidopa, levodopa. It's taken once a day, and again, we encourage people to take it roughly the same time every day.
Same time every day?
Roughly, I mean, again, if you tend to take it at lunchtime, then whether lunch is at 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock, which may vary from day to day, we encourage people to take it at lunchtime.
Thank you.
Sure, there's a question here.
This just got approved this year. in the United
No,
States.
I think it's about 2019.
So the unfortunate part about how we launched this drug is we launched it Halloween weekend of 2019, sliding right into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then COVID.
Has it been used in other countries before we
It's been
approved it?
used in Japan. There's almost 100,000 people on Nourianz in Japan right now.
Okay, they've been using it for several years now.
So the question, just for people who are online, since they can't hear the conversation, was when was this approved in the US? And it was approved in 2019 and launched just around the holidays at the end of 2019. And then really lost traction because of COVID. It was approved in Japan, I think in 2015. And there are about 100,000 people in Japan that are actually on that.
Question?
There's another question here.
Okay, so if I brought my father to you and said, Dad's doing pretty well, but let's see if we can make him even better, would you say, well, okay, I'm willing to put your dad on this drug just to see if it can make him better? Or would you say, no, he's got to be showing specific negative signs before you'd be willing to just try him on a drug like this?
So the question in the room was that if a patient came to me who was doing pretty well, but then he said, I'd like to see him doing better, would I try this medication? And the answer I would give is it depends what you would like to see better. Because if it's just that they're generally moving slowly and there's not these periods where there are fluctuations where you distinguish off from not, then it probably isn't the right answer in that situation. Because this is a pretty much those off periods. So there are other things that I would think about. It could be increasing one of the existing medications. The dose just to try to boost everything. It could be introducing another medication. It just depends on the regimen. But this is medication again that was approved specifically for treating off periods. And so as a result of that, we try to I personally try to stick with things on label when I can. Among other things, especially for a branded drug, it's a whole lot easier to get it approved by an insurance company when you're using it in a non-label fashion. Plus the safety and efficacy were established for that particular population. There's another question.
This is a personal question. I take amantadine as well as would I take this additional instead of amantadine?
So there's a question about whether this can be used along with amantadine or instead of, and the answer is that it can be used in either fashion. It doesn't necessarily replace an antidote. Again, there are a variety of reasons why someone may be taking an antidote. One of the biggest uses in my own practice is actually to treat dyskinesia. And so knowing that this is a medication that actually can increase dyskinesia, I would be reluctant to take away something that is potentially blocking dyskinesia and then adding something that increases dyskinesia. So it's a balancing act, and it's the tolerability. You know, can someone tolerate both medications at the same time? But unfortunately, you don't necessarily know that until you try it. Are there any other questions on mine? I don't.
Do you know the statistics, or if it has ever been used with somebody with Parkinson's and dementia?
So that's an interesting question. So people who have dementia works through studies.
Mhm.
So, and because of the risks of, I'm sure it has been used. There's just not a lot of good data around it. And I know it's been used because I've actually used it in my population. But in the studies, people who had dementia works through the study, people who had pre-existing hallucinations, delusions, other forms of psychosis were also excluded. So we know that that's a concern. It's something that the hallucinations were seen at the 40 milligram dose studies. So you have to be careful about introducing it in that population.
So some of your patients, they have had dementia with Parkinson's and have tried this themselves.
Yes, I've had patients who have dementia, but you know,
Good results.
It really, I mean, so it's hard to generalize for individual patients. So
Yeah.
I'll start by saying that.
Yeah.
I have some who have done well, and I have some who haven't necessarily done as well.
Mhm.
And so there's that variability.
Still,
But that's,
don't know till you
again,
try thing.
that's the art of treating people with Parkinson's, is that each person is different, and so we individualize the therapies for those individuals. So yes,
Mhm.
and so I was a snowflake disease
Mhm.
because everyone is a little bit different.
So is there, especially in Japan, is there any drugs that counteracts this drug, or it has a contraindicated the drug, like a beta blocker or an antibiotic, or that is pumped up with all the people being put on this drug?
Good lady. So the question is,
I've been doing this 23 years. I have a lot of contraindications in my life.
are there any drugs that are contraindicated with this? And the reason that Sue Ellen is glad that question was asked is because the short answer is no. I mean, there's some drugs that are contraindicated in Parkinson's. That would be the bigger issue. But in terms of interactions with this particular medication, no. There's nothing.
So other neurologists who prescribe this drug hasn't said, hey, I've noticed that when I use this drug and patients on this other drug, that things seem to be.
No. Again, remember, especially if you're talking about Parkinson's drugs, the thing is that the more drugs you introduce, especially if they're higher doses, the greater the risk you have of running some of those typical side effects, whether it's dyskinesia, hallucinations, lightheadedness, fatigue, impulse control disorders, etc. So there's an additive effect with medications, unfortunately.
I guess two patient populations you're going to avoid use, and the doctor's going to know that. And if somebody skips it in the doctor's office, it's going to red flag it at the pharmacy level. Is people taking a strong CYP3A4 inducer, which ketoconazole.
Right. It's ketoconazole is one. Rifampin. So
Yeah, so stuff that's not really widely used. And then if you have severe hepatic impairment.
bad liver disease.
Yeah.
Which isn't a drug interaction. And so it's not, I mean, there's no interaction that is a true, I mean, so the drugs that are the enzyme inducers are a problem, but that's a different issue. It's not an actual safety issue. It's a lack of getting sufficient levels to be effective. So.
And this is an off-course question, and it might be more for the company to answer, or it just might be it's not what it was developed for. But has this ever been tested on somebody that is perfectly healthy, that has no Parkinson's, no nothing, to see what this does?
So the reality is that drug that's on the market, it's a newer drug. I can't speak things in terms of how drugs were developed, but the first stage in drug development today, the first human, is healthy normal volunteers.
Yeah, and that's why I asked that, because I was.
It was studied in healthy normal volunteers without Parkinson's or anything like that before it was ever studied in someone who has Parkinson's.
Yeah, because since it was developed in Japan, I wasn't sure how they did it too, if they still do the same guidelines. So
one of the things is the FDA requires that if the drug is going to be considered for approval,
it still has to go through the Okay.
something must be studied.
Okay. Good. All right. Yeah, because I'm going to research that and see what the results are for that as well. Just because I've been
Also, the
interested
safety
in
data so they don't necessarily have efficacy data, obviously, because they're not treating people with Parkinson's.
Yeah.
But all the safety data from those initial studies are included in the label. When you saw liver failure in the early studies before it was ever tested on Parkinson's, that would be included in the label in terms of, so it's not just the Parkinson's population.
Okay.
When you look at safety data for this drug.
Great.
So it's interesting because then he can speak to this better than I can. You come to market 2 years ago with a group of side effects, but then after the drug's been out for a while, you get what they call treatment emergent side effects, which is what we have a list of those now, like orthostatic hypotension, falls. Falls were less for people taking Nourianz than taking placebo. Doesn't affect orthostatic hypertension to a greater degree, less than placebo. So things like that come out that are called treatment emergent side effects.
But what that basically means is, the numbers were provided as part of the slides is someone experienced something while they're taking medication. They report it to KIWA and they report it to the FDA. And so they capture all that information and then it gets added to the profile. This is the safety profile, which is why we talk about things like falls, drops in blood pressure, because those are things that happen among people with Parkinson's. And so it's bound to happen. It doesn't necessarily give you a comparison. So the study gives you a comparison between two groups, whereas these treatment emergent adverse events actually are things that happen in people taking medication in real world settings. So that's just part of the process of capturing. And sometimes if you start to see trends, those are very, very important. So there were some drugs that were COX-2 inhibitors, for example, that there were cardiovascular data that became very evident when the drugs were on the market that were not as clear before those drugs got approved, although then there were suits of companies holding data and things like that, just a little bit different, but it became very clear that there was a central class of medication. So,
Like Vioxx, right?
yeah, Vioxx,
Yeah.
drugs that are only one of those is still on the market.
All right. Any other questions?
He's veterinary.
Right, yeah.
No, who's his neurologist?
Oh, neurologist.
Hadera.
Hadera, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I work with his father one-on-one in home.
Oh, I know that's what, okay, I got you.
I know.
Any other questions?
Anything?
All right.
Talk to my
All right. Thank you, guys. Yeah, thank you, guys. And then also, because I didn't get you on recording introducing yourself at first, I'll have you reintroduce yourself here at the end, just so you're introduced on the recording for people at the end.
So my name is Aaron Ellenbogen. I'm a neurologist at the Michigan Institute for Neurological Disorders.
All right. And then Sue, if you would like to come up as well, so people can just either put a face to you since you're going to be kind of in the community.
Will they be able to hear me?
If
you stand close
no, probably not, but this is Sue Ellen, and you guys will probably see her around a lot more.
So I
All
tell
right.
them that if they want to Yeah, if they
Oh,
want to
what-
talk to their doctor. Like I said, my name is Sue Ellen. I live in Huntington, West Virginia, but I'm in Louisville at least 2 times a week, and I'm really here almost every day a week. If this is something you decide that you want to talk to your physician about, tell them to reach out to me. Always available, always in town. I have samples. I have information on which pharmacy is it. But yeah, feel free to reach out and have your physician office call me if samples is something that you all want to try. But it was nice to see you all. I watched that here.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Okay, yes.